Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, fan of lots of things Japanese. And this is part 5 in a series of videos that I've been making about traveling in Japan. And I've talked about travel, I've talked about accommodation, I've talked about behavior, and today I'm going to talk about food, which is sort of crazy because I'm not an expert on this. I'm not an expert on anything. The subject of Japanese food is so huge that it's kind of ridiculous to even do, a video on it at all and expect to cover everything. And obviously, I'm not going to cover everything. I'm going to talk about a few things, and we'll see where we go. When I ask my son what he likes about Japan, the first thing he always says is the food. And it's always something that I find a tiny bit hard to get my head around because my first experience of Japan, the thing that sort of terrified me the most was the food. This was in the late 1980s. I was moving to Japan to work there for a year, turned into 2 years. I had no prior experience or knowledge of Japan at all. I was coming from northern England and had been raised on a northern English post-war diet. I had traveled in Europe, so my horizons were a little bit wider than they would otherwise have been. But, I was used to a fairly limited range of food. And the stuff that I encountered in Japan was, frankly, terrifying. I remember being shown where the local supermarket was and shown how to work my cooker and what have you in the apartment, and then being sort of left. And it was really, really daunting. And I would wander around the supermarket with absolutely no clue how to prepare the food that was for sale. Sometimes I wasn't even sure it was food because it was so far out of my experience. And I lost a ton of weight in the first few months that I was there because I didn't know what to eat. Obviously, after 2 years and after many other visits back to Japan, my sense of Japanese food has changed a lot. But I just want to say that for some people, the prospect of going to Japan and eating is immediately exciting, right? Because they love Japanese food. And for other people, it's daunting. So I'm just going to start this conversation by saying I get that. I understand why it can be, let's say, intimidating, right? So again, I'm not going to detail every kind of Japanese food that you're going to encounter. That would be crazy. But let me walk through a number of things that I think you should look out for and you should try. So let's think. One of the first things we think of when we think about Japanese food is raw fish of some sort, sushi or sashimi, and the difference, you can argue about it, but the difference is really whether or not it comes with rice. If it doesn't, it's sashimi. And if it does, it is sushi, sort of. And obviously there's lots of different kinds of sushi. There's maki, which is a roll of some sort, usually with nori, with seaweed or something. And this is one of those elements of Japanese food which I found really intimidating. But I have acquired a taste for it. I love it. And I probably eat more sushi and sashimi than the people in my family when we go to Japan. I would say if it's something you're not used to, go for the tried and true. Go for the maguro, the tuna, and things like that, which are relatively light. My wife eats a lot of kappa maki, which is basically just cucumber. Find your way into what you are comfortable with. Obviously, it's usually you can flavor it with soy sauce and wasabi as a way of sort of spicing it up. But above all, as with everything on this list, I would say try it. And everybody knows sort of what sushi and sashimi is, so I'm not going to say much about that. One of the scariest things about sushi outside Japan is the cost. Even mediocre sushi can be very expensive. In Japan, this is simply not the case. And I mean, this meal that we had, I think on that machine that you can see us ordering from, there were like 16 pages of different sushi items, and we ordered a constant stream of stuff, of everything that we fancied, everything that we felt like. We had a complete meal for three of us, main meal of the day, and it cost us the equivalent of about $40. That was in Kanazawa, where the sushi is particularly good and fresh. The one thing I would say also, and this is sort of a subset because it's not sushi, is that you must try unagi. Unagi is eel. It's broiled and usually served with a slightly sweet sauce, a slightly sticky sort of barbecue sauce. And it's really good. And for me, it was one of the ways to get into eating more fish because it's cooked and it's rich, and it's really good. And you'll find dedicated unagi restaurants, but you'll often find it also as one of the things that you can have in a sushi restaurant as well. Sushi introduces us to one of the things that you're going to have a lot, which is rice. Japanese rice tends to be a shorter grain than a lot of the rice that I grew up with, which is more like basmati, more like Indian rice, which tends to be a longer, thinner grain. But again, it's one of those things that you acquire a taste for. It's often served as a side dish with almost anything. You can, no matter what kind of restaurant you're in, you can order a bowl of rice. It will generally come plain. You can add some sort of dashi or something to it, some spice to it if you wish, but more often than not, you eat it plain just with chopsticks. And a lot of restaurants will serve rice as a sort of standard side. The alternative to rice is some sort of noodle, right? Whether we're talking about ramen or soba or udon and lots of other kinds of noodles. It depends, Soba is a buckwheat noodle. It's often served cold. It's very refreshing. It's thin and light. You can also get it fried up as yakisoba. Ramen, you know ramen. Udon is the thickest of the noodles. It's more like it's quite heavy pasta almost, compared to either ramen or soba. Don't assume that the instant ramen that you have in the States or in the UK or wherever is representative of what you're going to get in Japan. It's not. Some of the best food I have in Japan is at little hole-in-the-wall ramen restaurants, and there'll be a huge range of different kinds. A lot of noodle dishes involve pork in some way. Either they're part of the stock, the way that the actual soup is flavored, or you'll have pieces of pork in there. Be alert to that if you are kosher or halal or vegetarian. But yeah, the noodle dishes are rich and warming and wonderful, and often you can get just amazingly good stuff at very ordinary looking, not very prepossessing restaurants. Sometimes, just sort of literally a hole in the wall, like a hatch, and you get your bowl and you eat at the counter kind of thing there. Or, things that are a little bit larger but really, really low key. But the food is often really, really good, hearty and full of flavor, fantastic stuff. So, again, if some of the more foreign, quote unquote, flavors of Japanese food are not as much to your taste or in your sort of familiar wheelhouse, things like ramen places and other noodle houses, I think are worth exploring while you sort of get comfortable. Onigiri Onigiri is a rice cake. Often it's sort of triangular shape, pyramid shape maybe. Often it has some sort of filling. Sometimes that's salmon or tuna or like a pickled plum, like umeboshi. And usually they're wrapped, not always, usually they're wrapped in nori. And you can buy these practically anywhere, right? It's one of the things that we get a lot of at convenience stores, what they call kombini stores, like 7-Eleven, Lawson, Family Mart, and they usually have a good selection of onigiri, which are immaculately packaged. And I meant to take some video over this, and I didn't. But there's a wonderful packaging thing. All things in Japan are beautifully packaged. But it's also very clever because the rice is wrapped in dried seaweed. If the rice, which is quite moist, is in contact with the seaweed will go soggy and you lose that crunch when you bite into it, which we don't want to do. So they're wrapped in such a way that you follow the directions and you unpack, you unpeel the outer cellophane in such a way that you find that the nori is kept separate from the rice until the moment that you open it. Then it comes in contact and then you eat it, fairly quickly before the nori can get soft. Good. And a great sort of portable snack for breakfast or railway journeys or whatever. In terms of other things that you're already going to be familiar with, tofu. Tofu shows up quite a lot. Again, it comes in more forms than you're probably used to in the US, unless you search for, firmer or softer kinds of tofu. It'll show up in soups. It'll show up in something like kitsune udon, where a piece of tofu is fried and added to the noodle dish. It's called kitsune udon because apparently it's the favorite food of foxes. So all you Baby Metal fans out there need to be eating kitsune udon. One of the foods that is an acquired taste even for Japanese people, I think, is natto. Natto is a fermented soybean dish that looks almost like it's got cheese on it because it gets quite stringy. It smells really, really strongly, and for years I couldn't eat it at all. I found it absolutely sort of unpleasant to the point of nauseating, And then, but different kinds of natto vary quite a bit. And when we were staying, I mentioned before, we stayed in a Buddhist temple, and there was quite a lot of natto served while we were there because it's an all-vegetarian diet. And natto, of course, is very rich in protein and supposedly good for you in other ways as well. And being presented with it in situations where I didn't have a choice, I thought, okay, I'm going to eat it. And I acquired a taste for it very quickly. The smell is pretty strong, it can be, but the beans have a kind of nutty, rich sweetness, which is actually quite nice. I don't know that I will eat a lot of natto by choice, but at least from time to time, I actually quite enjoy it. Miso, you'll come across a lot. Miso is a bean paste derivative. And it comes in different forms. It can come obviously as a soup, a very mostly clear soup, very lightly flavored. It's used a lot in broths for noodles, and it's really good. Also used in sweetened forms as sauces, and there are a number of places that we went to where it was used as a kind of barbecue sauce on like yakitori and things like that, which I don't think I'd ever had before, and I really, really liked it. So much so that I'm actually going to try to figure out how to make it, a miso-based barbecue sauce. It's really good. On the subject of pork, tonkatsu, a breaded, fried pork cutlet, is a common meal. Also, you often get that with some sort of salad, shredded cabbage and things like that, often with rice. But also you can have it as an added element with a noodle dish like udon. or with some sort of curry sauce. Japanese curry is a relatively late invention. I guess it was introduced to Japan not from India, as you would expect, but by British sailors who had got it from India in whatever sort of bastardized English form they had it. But it's passed on to Japan. Japanese curries don't generally have the range of different types and flavors that you get with Indian curries, and they are generally not as spicy. Though I would say, that usually restaurants will often offer you a choice of how hot you want it. Not usually, is that true? Certainly in some places. And in little, very unprepossessing curry houses like Coco Curry, which my son loves, they will give you a choice. And it's there's the baseline spice level, and then you can add it. I think the number goes from like 1 to 15. I had mine at level 5, and it was pretty hot. And I like hot food, but it was actually quite hot. And my son had it at level 10, and it was very hot. So, do not assume that just because Japanese food for the most part is not very spicy, that if you ask for something really, really spicy, it won't be. That's not the case. But curry, with a sauce over rice, again, one of those really rich, warming dishes, and a distinctly Japanese take on curry, quite unlike an Indian curry or a Thai curry or something like that. It's a totally different kind of thing. Great with sort of root vegetables, but also with chicken and pork and maybe shrimp and so on. Yeah, good stuff. There are what they call nabemono, which is basically a one pot dish, and some restaurants will specialize in this, and it includes things like oden, which is a sort of basically a stew, or shabu shabu, or sukiyaki. Shabu shabu and sukiyaki are again one pot stews made with thin sliced beef. Um, it's not really, honestly, it's not really my thing. I think part of it is that it's quite expensive in Japan. Beef is expensive generally. And I generally don't eat that much beef in Japan. If you're in somewhere like Kobe, where the beef is particularly famous and good, then I would recommend that you try it once. It's very tender and flavorful, and it's really good. But it is pricey. And most of the time in Japan, I don't eat a lot of beef. And one of the things I noticed that in places where there are a lot of tourists, the shabu shabu and sukiyaki type places are always full of foreigners, which to me is a sort of turn off. But I think people gravitate to the idea of, beef stuff because it's what they're familiar with. They're used to it. But for me, and I would say for most, I don't think most Japanese people eat a lot of beef on a daily basis. It's an occasional treat, but for me, I don't want to spend the money. Tempura. Tempura, of course, is fried vegetables, fish, shrimp, which has been very lightly battered in panko in a very sort of light, crisp, flaky batter, and then cooked very quickly in hot oil. And when done properly, it's super light and crisp and really, really good. And you'd think it was going to feel greasy or unhealthy, and doesn't at all if it's done well. So yeah, tempura, I'm sure you've come across this, but yeah. Doria. Doria is a comparatively new pseudo-Japanese invention where it's basically a kind of take on, if you can imagine, a sort of traditional Italian pasta sauce or something like it with rice. It's almost like a risotto, and sometimes they're sort of tomatoey or with a sort of beef or béarnaise sauce. Sometimes it's more creamy, but it's basically a rice dish flavored with pasta type sauces. And I think it's a sort of, maybe it's a post-war thing. It's not an old Japanese thing, but it's something that I think is part of present day Japanese cuisine. And it's good. We make it at home all the time. Bread in Japan, how can I put this? They're really good at what they do, but there's not a lot of variety, and there's not a lot of what makes, to me, having been raised on bread, there's not a lot of what makes bread interesting. Japanese bread is almost exclusively white. It tends to, you'll buy it in small slices, sliced loaves. It's not even a full loaf, it's like half a dozen slices. It's quite synthetic, it's quite sweet. The crusts are usually cut off completely, and it's very, very light and, good for a certain kind of sandwich. That I buy them sandwiches at the convenience stores with egg salad and pork and various other things on them, and I like that, especially for breakfast. But the bread itself is not terribly interesting. And then there are a lot of sort of baked, they call these things generally pan, after the French word for bread. And they tend to be very, very light and airy and often sweet, sort of little mini pastries and things, which are nice. They're not quite what you might expect them to be. Sometimes they're flavored with things like sweet corn. They'll have sweet corn in them, or a sauce, or a hot dog, or something. But the bread itself, as I say, is often quite sweet. I would say, always be alert to local specialties. If you're in somewhere like Yamanashi, you always have hotto, which is a noodle dish. Again, a sort of very rich, heavy stew. It's not what you would call a sophisticated kind of dish. It's a very large, flat noodle, like a super large linguine or something. Again, rich and hearty and tasty. In Hiroshima, you have to have okonomiyaki. You can get okonomiyaki anywhere, and it's a sort of a street food, especially in festivals and things. But it's particularly common in Hiroshima, and a lot of places really pride themselves on it, and a lot of local variations on traditional okonomiyaki. Okonomiyaki is usually a sort of a batter pancake with cabbage and other ingredients. In Hiroshima, it also has noodles, which are sort of folded into the pastry, and they're not sort of chopped up and made, sort of rendered as tiny fragments within the batter. They're clearly noodles. It's again really filling and substantial, and you can buy these on the street or in restaurants that are dedicated to it. And they cook them right there on the hot plates and so on. Really, really good. One of the best meals we had on this trip, I would say, was a particular little tiny hole-in-the-wall okonomiyaki restaurant in Hiroshima with a line out the door. That's always a good thing, right? Especially if the line isn't foreigners. If it's local people who know it's good, rather than foreigners who've seen it in a guidebook and have been told to go there because somebody has a commission or something. One of the other kinds of food that you will encounter, I've talked about this a little bit with in ryokan, in traditional Japanese hotels, as something like kaisaki, which is a traditional form of Japanese food which is constructed of lots of different small plate courses. It's almost like tapas or something, right? Though they're not generally to be shared, they're individual, and you get loads of different ones. You get like a sashimi plate and a tempura plate and a noodle dish and so on, right? And pickles and various other things. And they're absolutely beautiful, and the idea is to sort of present you with a range of different flavor and texture possibilities. Really, so good, but again, either those are going to be sort of more high-end restaurants, or they're going to be traditional hotel-type places, ryokan and things like that. Takoyaki. This is, I guess, came from Osaka originally, I think, but there are areas of Tokyo that specialize in takoyaki, and it's basically a fried octopus ball with various sort of flavors and crispy fish flakes on the outside. Really good. Again, one of those things that I think I didn't know I was going to like. And I really, really enjoyed it. And, you can't beat some of these little restaurants for, again, feeling like you're part of the community, part of the culture, and not simply sort of doing tourist stuff, where you go, where it's full of people either out for the evening or on their way home from work or something. I love those sort of diner kind of restaurants where you see local people. And, in terms of restaurants, as I've mentioned, the hole-in-the-wall places that you'll find, especially in major cities, they're all over the place, in the sort of downtown area, particularly close to railway stations and entertainment districts, tiny little restaurants where the food's fantastic. And I would say just trial and error, and don't be embarrassed to go into small places and just figure out how you're going to order. Some of these places you order through a waiter service, and some of them you order at the counter, and some of them you will order by purchasing a ticket at some sort of vending machine. And that can sometimes be a little tricky to navigate if there's no English on there. But I would just say explore. Look, there are usually pictures of some sort, or you can ask somebody what they think is the best, what would they recommend, Ichiban oishii wa dochi desu ka? That kind of phrase will work some of the time. So there are Izakaya type bar restaurants where you get a lot of bar food, including things like yakitori. I love Japanese yakitori, and there are restaurants that are dedicated to it. Yakitori is skewered chicken, usually, not exclusively, but usually. And it's usually charcoal grilled or flame barbecued somehow. And it's cheap. And the Japanese are really good at using the whole chicken. So in addition to leg and breast meat, you'll get gizzards and hearts and skin and cartilage. And I would recommend that you try them. My son and I had hearts and really enjoyed it. He was not enthusiastic initially, but he really liked them. And the skin, when it's really crispy and salted, or served in some sort of teriyaki sauce or that sort of miso barbecue sauce that I mentioned earlier, really, really good. I go back for that stuff over and over again. Love it. I mentioned the konbini stores, the convenience stores, Lawson, Family Mart, 7-Eleven, and there's a lot of food in those places, including stuff that you can take home and add hot water to, the sort of instant noodles and things like that, but also a lot of other sort of one-dish meals or bento sort of lunchbox type things. You can buy a lot of this kind of stuff there. They usually have a case of yakitori and fried foods and things like that, or croquettes, potato croquettes and other things, which they will warm up for you on the spot if you want them to. And they have a full selection of food and drinks. So if you're going back to your hotel and you just want to take a snack with you, that's a great option. And then there are places that are more like fast food. I've mentioned the sort of hole-in-the-wall noodle shops, and I guess those can be considered fast food. There's also things like the cocoa curry that I mentioned before, and then there are more Western style fast food, though I would say not as much as they used to be. When I lived in Japan, even in a relatively small town like Kofu, there were, I think, 3 McDonald's. One right in the railway station complex, one close to the movie theater, and then another further south. Those are all gone now. They're not there. And though I did see McDonald's, especially in Tokyo, I think I saw another couple here and there, but nowhere near as big a footprint as they used to have in Japan, which I don't think is a bad thing, right? There are various Japanese sort of equivalents like Lotteria and Mossburger, but they're quite different. I mean, you might want to try something like Mossburger as an experiment, but the burgers are almost unrecognizable as burgers. The flavor is different, the consistency is different, the bread is different, the sauce is different. It's quite different. So, I mean, in a way, that's a good thing, right? Because it means you're still sampling something Japanese. And I will say that the fries at Moss Burger are fantastic. Some of the best fries in the world. Again, as I said, there used to be a lot more of those kind of American chain restaurants, Denny's, Jonathan's, which I had never encountered in the UK, of course, but they were quite widespread in Japan. Not so much anymore. They're still around, and they're, solid. They offer a fairly sort of predictable sampling of most kinds of food, most Japanese food, but nowhere near as many of them as there used to be. So it's interesting the way that Japan sort of fell in love with the West and Western notions of success and capitalism and so on. And then as its own economy collapsed, it seems to have gone a little bit more native. That's just my sense. Certainly you don't see as many of those kind of places as you used to. Mr. Donut, you do see those. And I assume Mr. Donut is originally a US chain, though I don't think I've ever seen a Mr. Donut in the US. Mr. Donut are awesome. And we went for breakfast a couple of times to Mr. Donut. Again, it's not really like any Western place I've ever been to or grown up with. And they vary quite a bit. We went to one in Tokyo, which was pretty average and not much of a selection. We went to one in Kanazawa, but we went to one there, and there were dozens and dozens of different donuts, some of them sort of savory, more like pies, flavored with cheese and bacon and stuff like that, and a huge range of donuts that were just fantastic. Really, really good. Good coffee. Way to start the day in an interesting way. As far as drink is concerned, Japanese beer is mostly of the same sort of crisp Pilsner type lagers. It's made not just with barley and hops and such, but usually has rice in it, which means that the flavor is different. As I say, it's a very light, very crisp kind of beer and works really well with Japanese food. This time I saw some more beer variety than I had seen before. Beer that was flavored with other things like yuzu, a number of local breweries making darker, richer IPA type beers and things like that. I'd never seen that before. I also don't think I'd ever seen Japanese gin before. I mean, I've had some Japanese gin like Roku, but I noticed a number of gins that seems to be, becoming a thing in Japan. Japanese whiskeys are, some of the best in the world. So yeah, I recommend sampling stuff like that. Shochu, which is almost a bit like a vodka, usually a lower alcohol proof, and is the base of a lot of mixed drinks, a lot of fruit, highball type things, Good options, good choices. Sake, of course. My family doesn't drink a lot of sake, so I tend to have it by myself, especially with sushi and sashimi. I usually have it warm, but I'm not a connoisseur by any means. But you don't have to. I mean, if it's not something that you know a lot about, you can drink fairly cheaply and really enjoy it. As I said, you can buy food practically anywhere. If you're there at a time when there's a festival, check out the street food, whether it's squid on a stick or okonomiyaki or whatever, or, sort of those ice things, I don't know what you call them, where you put the syrup on the ice, and that sort of street food, party food, forms of a fried dough and things like that, classic fun, or those, what do they call them, tornado potato things, where it's like a single potato cut into a long spiral and deep fried. It's great stuff. It's fun, and just a good way to sort of when you don't want to be bothered going to a restaurant. If you have those options, they're really fun. If you're looking to buy food for yourself, there are grocery stores. Because the convenience stores cover a fair amount, grocery stores are a little farther apart and fewer than you might expect. You can find them, and grocery stores are always super fun to explore. You get to see ordinary local people buying the sort of stuff that they live on, and you get to see exactly how everything's packaged and how things are priced and the range of stuff that's considered to be normal within this culture. It's fascinating to me. I love that. I love wandering around grocery stores in foreign countries, particularly in Japan. You often find them in the basements of department stores and railway stations. I'm not entirely sure why. I guess because the railway station is a sort of transport hub and people are stocking up, before they go home or something. But yeah, in the big department stores like Okajima and those kind of places, the lowest level will often be food. There are often restaurants in these places, but there's often basically grocery stores as well. The other thing I'd say is also vending machines. You will see vending machines everywhere in Japan, and you can buy almost anything. Obviously, the most you'll see is for drinks, whether that's juices or sodas or teas and coffees, whether that's iced or hot. You get hot stuff in vending machines in Japan. Beer and sake and shochu and things also you can buy in vending machines. I didn't see as many of them as I used to. But you can even get like sushi from a vending machine, which, Japan is the only country in the world where I would risk that. And you can get hot noodle dishes and all. It's amazing. It's amazing. The only issue, of course, is then finding somewhere where you can eat without giving offense. But yeah, you can get a lot of stuff in vending machines. It's really, really amazing. Obviously, you're in Japan to have Japanese stuff, including Japanese food. If you want to have a different kind of food, my recommendation would be to stay Asian, particularly, especially in somewhere like Tokyo. Korean food, there's a substantial Korean quarter within Tokyo, and some great Korean restaurants. Chinese, Thai, Vietnamese, and Indian, I would say, are the best as far as non-Japanese food is concerned. Oh, the last thing I will say is that restaurants can have weird opening and closing times. You can find these out often by using your apps on your phone, your Google Maps or your whatever. You can look stuff up and see when things are open. But it does seem to me sometimes that places would close every time we were hungry on principle. Some places that are only open for lunch, some places that are only open for dinner, and some places that sort of are open in the middle of the day, and then you sit down for dinner and within half an hour they're telling you that they're ready to close. So it can be a little disorienting sometimes. So if you see somewhere open that you really want to go to, find out when it closes, because I couldn't figure out a pattern. It's not like there's a general rule. It seems like a lot of places just close when they feel like it. That's probably not right, but it does feel like it sometimes. And this leads me to maybe my last point. When a lot of restaurants are closed, you always have the railway stations. And that might sound crazy because most railway stations and airports and things anywhere else in the world, the food's not going to be great. It's going to be overpriced. It's not going to be very good. It might not even be very hygienic. Absolutely not the case in Japan. Every railway station that you go to, especially in a major city, will have a substantial number of restaurants. And it's not like a food court. There's discrete, separate restaurants, and the food is often absolutely superb, perfectly reasonably priced, and open pretty much all the time. And that's the key. And often, at a major city, you go and there might be a dozen restaurants in the railway station. sometimes on different levels, and they're surprisingly good and reasonable. So yeah, I would strongly recommend that. Don't think that, oh, going to the railway station's a bit of a come down. It's a bit, not doing the authentic stuff. It's absolutely not. These are real restaurants. They're often making, went to noodle houses, noodle shops in railway station restaurants where they're making all the noodles from scratch on site. It's quite different from the West, where the stuff's going to be coming in frozen and packaged and what have you. It's not like that at all. Really, really good. So yeah, I think that's all I'm going to say. Um, there's a lot of variety, a lot of different flavors and opportunities. Don't be intimidated by it. Go in and try stuff. Find out what you like. Find out what you can acquire a taste for. That's big. I think we seem to be moving as a culture where people dip their toe in the water, and if it doesn't immediately connect with them, then they say, oh, I'm never going to do that again. As an educator, of course, that's not the way I think about these things. Often I think you try something, whether it's a book or a TV show or a piece of music or kind of food or a drink, and it doesn't immediately work for you, and you then have to sort of get used to it. You educate your palate, right? In all things. Sometimes you have to sort of train yourself to appreciate stuff. And when you have, you experience it in a more rich and complex way, which I think is actually a good thing. Who enjoys their first pint of beer? Not very many people. I think that's all I'm going to say. I mean, obviously this is just the tip of the iceberg, and all I want to do is whet your appetite a little bit and say, if you find some of this stuff a little daunting, a little intimidating, it'll be fine. You'll find your way through, but just don't assume that you're going to eat at McDonald's every day, because you may as well not go. It's part of the experience. It's exciting. It's an adventure, and you're going to leave, Eventually you're going to leave, you're going to go back home, and you'll have your McDonald's and you'll have your steakhouses and stuff. Don't do that in Japan. Again, it won't be as good as you think it's going to be, because it's not what the locals specialize in. But you just don't want to be doing that. You want to experience the culture as it is. And for a couple of weeks, surely, you can put what you're accustomed to aside and experience the stuff that is there for you. That's what makes the trip worth going for. That's what makes it exciting, to experience something different from home. All right, that's it. As ever, please, what am I going to do next? I had said that what I would do next is maybe a video or videos recommending certain places to visit, particularly if they're a little bit off the beaten track. I'm not going to say anything about Kyoto because it's sort of self-evident. But maybe I'll talk about a few places that I think are really worth the effort of visiting. And again, as ever, you can share your experience, comment, make recommendations or requests. Feel free to chime in and tell me what you like. We're talking about food, so tell me what you really like and maybe where you get it. Japanese people, if you want to make specific recommendations for where to eat, I would love that. All right, thanks. Like, comment, subscribe. Check out my Patreon page. Thank you, patrons. Check out my merchandise page. Check out my books. Look for Hideki Smith, Demon Queller, which is not out yet, but is available for pre-order, at least as an ebook in the US. It's available for pre-order as a paperback in the UK. All right, that's all for now. Thank you. I'll talk to you soon.